With large parts of the Sydney Basin still underwater, volunteers and communities, of course, pulling together to help those who are suffering with their lives and often businesses turned upside down yet again. It's a real worry that this is the third or fourth time for so many in just 2 years. Flood cleanups are a heartbreaking business, especially when the last one was just a few months back, and especially when insurance and other financial support can't be taken for granted. At least with the new federal government in place, responsibility for this flood isn't being pinned on the government itself. As we saw with Scott Morrison, he was criticised for allegedly not doing enough to tackle climate change. Remember back in March with the floods, particularly severe around Lismore in northern New South Wales, they were all blamed on the Prime Minister. Scott Morrison's only got himself to blame, said Adam Band from the Greens. He's the one who's made the terrible decisions. He's fast-tracked the climate crisis. He has refused to come and talk to locals about the floods that he helped cause. And then this.
Liberal and Labor haven't just given up, they are aiding the enemy by backing more coal and gas. I don't know how Liberal and Labor can look at towns like Cobargo, Mallacoota, Lismore or Ballina in the eye and tell them that opening a new coal and gas mine is a good idea. They have blood on their hands. They have the blood of the people who are trapped in their flooded homes.
As if opening or closing coal mines and cutting emissions by 28% or 43% is going to make any difference. Back in March in Lismore, the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison faced climate change protesters, even though Australia's record in cutting emissions has actually been better than many countries in the world, including Canada and New Zealand. But there was nothing like this today in Western Sydney for the new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. And he readily conceded this.
We know that Australia has always suffered from natural events, be they floods or bushfires, so we can't say that every single event is because of climate change.
Amazing what the difference an election campaign makes and a change of leadership. But he didn't altogether abandon his Green left religion.
If we continued to not take action globally on climate change, then these events, extreme weather events, would be more often and more intense. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that play out.
OK, well, let's look at the historical record, which in Windsor goes back to 1799. The Windsor flood peak in March last year was 12.9 metres. In March this year, the peak was 13.8 metres. And in this current flood, it's 13.9 metres. These have all been very destructive floods, no doubt about that, especially given the massive development now in Western Sydney in the 30 years since the last significant flood in 1992, which peaked then at just 11.1 metres. However, between 1809 and 1978, on no fewer than 10 occasions, floods at Windsor peaked at over 14 metres. The 1978 flood peaked half a metre higher than the current one. In 1816 and 1817, there were 2 floods within 7 months that peaked higher than any of the 3 floods we've just had in the past 15 months. And the daddy of all floods happened way back in 1867, peaking then at 19.7 metres, or almost 6 metres higher than current floods. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not for a moment minimising the destruction of these current floods or the pain that so many are experiencing right now, tonight, across the Sydney Basin. It's just that it's hard to say that it's all down to climate change, given that the worst floods happened more than 150 years ago, and to believe the claims that if the government minimises our emissions, it will reduce our exposure to natural disasters that always have and always will be a plague for this country. And while this year's Lismore flood was indeed the worst on record, 2 metres above the previous peak in 1954, there have been 29 major floods in that town since records were first kept in 1887. Back in 1906, the poet Dorothea Mackellar famously described Australia as a land of droughts and flooding rains. And this will always be the case, regardless of how much further the current government cuts our emissions. To help the residents in Western Sydney, which should be our objective, the best thing we can do is not scare people over climate change, but raise the Warragamba Dam wall, to give it a flood mitigation role, and to look carefully at other mitigation work we can do right across the river system. Now, we elect governments to do what we can't as ordinary citizens do. That means big dams, big infrastructure, and all the big decisions to keep us safe. This is what matters, and so too knowing your history to keep it all in perspective.